Hello, everyone. I hope you're all still with us, but I can see in the attendee numbers that it is all fine. So thanks for making it through the whole day with us. I think it was a joy rather than a task. We are now at the last presentation, which will be delivered by Oliver Rendle. Oliver Rendle is studying for his PhD at Manchester Metropolitan University, where he's researching the cultural interplay between horror, humor, and contemporary pessimistic philosophy, which will also inform his talk today. Very welcome, Oliver. Please share your materials. Thank you.
Hello. It's lovely to be here. It's a shame not to be there in Dublin, but needs must, I guess. Thank you for sticking it out all day, and for joining me for my paper, Leaving Early to Avoid the Rush, Pratchett, Perry, and Contemporary Pessimism. In it, I will be exploring how humour can be used to sustain contentious debates over emotionally charged subjects, in this instance, the right to die debate. This paper stems from a much larger project in which I study the progressive use of pessimistic and nihilistic philosophies, particularly when used in conjunction with humour. Via that thesis and in this paper, I argue that cynical worldviews like Pratchett's are cathartically and politically beneficial in communities where misinformation and hegemonic dogma can quickly lead to injustices. The philosophical repudiation Pratchett's work represents is exemplary of this, the author's pessimistic disposition in this case revealing a humanistic attitude towards death that supports the retention of dignity and comfort. It is worth reiterating here the content warning as such, as this paper will be discussing topics related to mental health and assisted death, which some may find distressing. That being said, this paper will be using the Discworld's death books, Mort, Reaperman, and Hogfather in particular, to show how Pratchett has used humour to offer a palatable, pessimistic ontology. For any uninitiated among us, the Discworld is a fantasy world ran in accordance with the narrative imperative. Stories and ideas have a physical presence here that includes such abstract concepts as time, war, chaos, etc. The death books in question concern one such anthropomorphic personification, Death, funnily enough, a 7-foot-tall, visually stereotypical Grim Reaper. Unlike many previous iterations of Death, however, Pratchett's character is wholly enamoured with humanity, coming to represent not just the Western world's perception of death, but its gentrification too. As Stacey Haynes has pointed out, the death sequence represents the metaphysical novels of the Discworld, where the titular character forces readers to examine what it means to be human and mortal. This makes these particular Discworld novels especially comparable to philosophical pessimism, as the latter system of beliefs likewise strips away intersocial assumptions in order to examine the value of life in the face of its negation. By rethinking Pratchett as a pessimistic humorist and engaging with these novels as the author's direct forays into the pessimistic mindset, I will highlight how Pratchett's fiction reveals the progressive potential of cosmological cynicism, for a certain type of subjectivity at least. Consequently, this paper situates Pratchett Studies itself as a site of significant critical intervention with a timeless, yet increasingly timely debate. For as technology increasingly blurs the line between life and death, such discussions around mortal agency become all the more pressing. To define the precepts of the worldview in question, I turn to arguably the most didactic work of contemporary pessimistic philosophy, Sarah Perry's Every Cradle is a Grave. Published in 2014, this book takes the negative ontology shared by such contemporary pessimists as Thomas Ligotti and Eugene Thacker and applies it to current legislature regarding antinatalism and suicide. In the process of doing this, Perry's book functionally outlines contemporary pessimism's estimation of life. Life, according to pessimism, is intrinsically bad, procreation immoral, and suicide an ethically privileged, rational response to the badness of life. Beneath thin veneers of false permanence, sacredness, loyalty, authority, and fairness All sources of existential, social, and individual meaning are, according to pessimism at least, ultimately characterized by illusion. On top of these insubstantial sources of faux purpose, every individual must also then face the unpleasant certainties of existence: loneliness, boredom, aging, the inevitability of death, which is to say nothing of the specific ailments afflicting certain individuals and or social groups. To cope with this, conscious beings live in a state of willful ignorance, keeping focused on ultimately underwhelming goals and unachievable fulfillments to carefully shield themselves from life's lack of purpose or meaning. In the words of Death himself, according to the pessimistic worldview, there is no good order, no hope, no mercy, no justice. There is just us. Compared to such a frank outline of this philosophy, Pratchett is, surprisingly, a much less vehement pessimist. And while Neil Gaiman has claimed that the Discworld was fueled by Pratchett's rage at an unfair universe, this is a rage that the hardcore pessimist rarely partakes in. Nevertheless, Discworld's death sequence consistently depicts hallmarks of this ontology, most blatantly at the climax of Hogfather, where death tells the reader that justice, mercy, duty, and that sort of thing are lies, fantasies designed to delude humans into believing that there is some rightness in the universe by which it may be judged. Similarly, in Mort, death tells readers that it is ridiculous to believe that chance governs the affairs of men, assuring other readers that no one gets pardoned for living, implying that crime with a corresponding death sentence. And at the climax of Reaperman, death pleads with the death of all universes, Azrael, the pernicious something that makes a nightmare of our world, as pessimist theorists would describe it, determined to win humanity the boon of a compassionate death. Through such instances, Pratchett indicates that once all anthropocentric delusions have been stripped away, every individual is akin to a blade of corn with an impossibly finite and futile existence from a pessimistic cosmological perspective. The only thing one can realistically hope for, therefore, is the care of the Reaperman. Though death later recants this, acknowledging that this is only a metaphor, this image is replaced with an even more explicitly pessimistic trope, that of the human automaton. Humans are driven literally by clockwork, death remarks, without any true agency beyond that of a will to live. And while Reaperman ends with a realization that people are, in fact, more than ears of corn, one should remember that Pratchett later wrote in Rentersmith that a metaphor is simply a kind or lie to help people understand what's true. Just as pessimism repudiates subjective values and structures, Pratchett's character death undermines humanity's fundamental assumptions at every opportunity, using his cosmological worldview as writers of the weird and cosmic horror have also done. They reveal the triviality of any and all anthropocentric phenomena. As such, the moral, ethical, and social values around which human civilization has, allegedly, been designed are revealed to be shared self-delusions, a human mask on an inhuman universe. It is worth noting that with his cosmological viewpoint, death is in fact a direct echo of the sentiment expressed through Pratchett's non-fiction. The following, for instance, has noticeable parallels to death's incredulous speech from the end of Hogfather. You want fantasy, here's one. There's this species that lives a few miles above molten rock and a few miles above a vacuum that would suck the air right out of them. They live in a brief geological period between ice ages, when giant asteroids have temporarily stopped smacking to the surface. As far as you can tell, there's nowhere else in the universe where they could stay alive for 10 seconds. And what do they call this fragile little slice of space and time? They call it real life. The cosmological perspective expressed here could easily be found in Lovecraftian fiction or pessimistic philosophy itself. However, the exasperated irony in this passage epitomizes what best separates Pratchett from most, but not all, pessimists: the fact that he often delivers this belief through humour. Throughout the Discworld's series, including the examples already given, humour is used in a host of subtle and not so subtle ways. The author's postmodern writing style drawing together parody, satire, verbal wit, physical comedy, and the carnivalesque, as the previous paper aptly showed. While it would be impossible to cover the mechanics and uses of all these forms here, there is one particular form of humour associated with death that specifically exemplifies the pessimistic worldview. Based around death answering questions or making statements which, not so subtly, pertain to his infinite power and reach, humour arises in these cases from the potentious clash between the human perspective and his own cosmological one. Take, for instance, the passage where Lezak, Mort's father, inquires after death's business. Where are you based exactly? From the uttermost depths of the sea to the heights where even the eagle may not go. Is it far? Further than the thickness of a shadow, said Death. Where the first primal cell was, there was I also. Where man is, there am I. When the last life crawls under freezing stars, there will I be. Ah, said Lezak, you get about a bit then. Lezak's blatant disregard towards Death's ominous replies may make him seem foolish, and his understatement would be amusing on its own. Yet the real humour here lies in the microcosmic situation itself, with an indulgent emphasis on the cosmic. Death's answers reiterate a truth that all humans must acknowledge on some rational level. Death is everywhere and cannot be escaped. Sidestepping this line of thought, though, Lezak refuses to allow himself to be drawn into contemplating the ramifications of Death's replies, carrying on with the cosmologically insignificant matter at hand, as all humans do according to pessimism. To Lezak, Death is simply a potential employer, and the incongruity between Death's profoundly disturbing aspect on the one hand and the man's blinkered practicality on the other results in a counterintuitively enjoyable meta-humour. Such situations are too numerous to be comprehensively covered here, but quite helpfully they are often explained and commented upon by Death himself, including in the passage above. Mort, terrified by his father's apparent blindness, is reassured by Death that Lezak is only allowing himself to see what his mind can cope with. Those such moments, and by drawing attention to them with meta-commentaries, Pratchett gifts his reader the perspective of Albert Camus' Sisyphus, the absurd man who recognises the ridiculousness of his place and purpose in the world, yet keeps pushing his boulder because that is all there is. Indeed, scholars have proposed that the Discworld series, and the death sequence in particular, be understood as a theatre of the absurd, based around humorously demonstrating the irrationality and arbitrariness of human values and assumptions. And through absurdity and the proto-pessimistic myth of Sisyphus, we arrive at the issue of suicide and assisted dying, the one truly serious philosophical problem, in Camus' humble opinion. After being diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's, Pratchett was very public about his views on ending one's own life, writing extensively on the subject and making the Emmy Award-winning Choosing to Die documentary, as we heartbreakingly just heard discussed. He expressed the crux of his argument in the Richard Dimbleby lecture in 2010, though, telling the Royal Society of Medicine in no uncertain terms that I have reached the conclusion that a person may make the decision to die because the balance of their mind is level, realistic, pragmatic, stoic, and sharp, advocating for the fully thought out and weighed up process of having one's life ended by gentle medical means. In the face of a disease that he saw as an unstoppable process of dying by degrees, Pratchett believed that he had the right to jump before being pushed, without anyone who assisted him being prosecuted for a clear act of mercy. In his own lifetime, Pratchett saw some progress towards this goal, yet to this day assisted suicide and euthanasia are both illegal in the author's native England, punishable by 14 years and a life sentence respectively. As fascinating and progressive as his activism was, though, Pratchett's fiction advocated for a death worth dying for far ahead of his diagnosis. Long before his disease catalysed the author's involvement in right to die debates, Pratchett's Discworld showcased a remarkably sympathetic and arguably progressive view towards death. In 1987, Mort meets the witch Goody Hamstring, who is relieved to be dying soon. It's time to move on, she says. And when Death tells Mort, "You could have had eternity," he replies that he was very lucky to have avoided it. In Reaperman, published 1991, Miss Flitwick remarks that after seeing what life does to people, death don't seem so bad. And the novel's secondary plot is entirely based around a character pursuing the death he feels cheated of, eventually embracing it with great relief, general optimism, and a feeling that on the whole, everything could have been much worse. Though martyrdom and suicide are not running themes in the Discworld series, from my reading within it at least, in Pratchett's fiction it is acknowledged that eventually death becomes preferable to life, and more often than not, the incongruity between such revelations constitutes moments of profoundly philosophical humour. While it may seem a redundant observation, therefore, the character Death acts as Pratchett's personification of a good death, implacable, yet genial, witty and accommodating, a symbol of both the ultimate reality and the ultimate equality. As Pratchett himself explained, this character is a kindly death, cleaning up the mess that this life leaves. Nikki Ann Moody noted that Death becomes a character that interests us because devotion to duty does not prevent him from taking the time to wonder at the demise of a tube worm, and from remaining in tune with the world around him. As such, Pratchett's character can be understood as a necessary part of life with plenty of care left in it, an artisan with enough concern for the customers, so to speak, to grant them a merciful and compassionate end. This death, then, is wholly opposed to the impersonal, systematic destroyer of life that the new version of death represents in Reaperman, a sinister entity who is created for unfeeling bureaucrats instead of human empathy, it is worth noting. Though he may be the harvester of mankind, the good death, the sharp edge to the inevitable scythe, cares enough about the harvest to give each blade of corn its own personal moment, during arguably the most intimate and lonely experience of its life. While making it clear that he stood against any so-called duty to die argument, though it's difficult to find anyone that supports this strange idea, Pratchett believed that a fetish for life at any cost was robbing individuals such as himself of their pride, self-respect, and human dignity. Perry's research demonstrates that this is indeed true, as life is forced upon Western society by those who shame, punish, and imprison anyone with a genuine desire to be rid of it. Consequently, Pratchett supported a policy that, if the burden gets too great, those who wish to should be allowed to be shown the door, a decision, he says, that demonstrated a gift of a furious sanity. Similarly, Perry unironically fantasizes about a land of free disposal, where philosophically and biologically mandated suffering is made truly optional, where those individuals who are unwilling or unable to be sedated by life's illusions can reclaim their agency, as suicide has been made easy, painless, and guaranteed. It was the compassion of this version of death that Pratchett recognized as the true fantasy in his lifetime. Thomas Ligotti, a notorious misanthrope and pessimist, once argued that pessimism without compromise lacks public appeal, and the radical anti-natalist pro-suicide stance is perhaps as uncomforting as it gets. With Pratchett, however, we find this compromise in the form of humour, offer of a pleasant experience in an unpleasant world, apparently. Comedy that is literally campaigning for the happiest possible ending. By juxtaposing human affairs with cosmological perspective, Pratchett envelops the audience in a humanistic portrayal of philosophical pessimism, inviting them to laugh at and with the final taboo. Humour therefore opens up a controversial debate by locating it as a site of pleasurable experience and intelligent critical thought. Through humour, therefore, Pratchett's pessimist philosophy helps repudiate nigh-on unstable ideological assumptions, including the ethical stance that life is worth more than pride, self-respect, and human dignity. Thank you.
Hello, Oliver. Thank you very much. That was a great talk, very eloquently spoken, very conscious also of everything that might be sensitive on the subject. So extremely well done. We do have questions coming in already. I'll just phrase them to you. With pessimism stating that we fill our lives with meaningless projects to distract ourselves, what do you think of Dev's obsession with human hobbies as shown throughout the series?
Well, it's a difficult question, that really, depending on whether you want to an answer from the perspective of a pessimistic philosopher who tend to be fairly bleak in those sorts of questions, or you can take it as somebody who's, a critic who is using this as a way to enact progressive change, I guess you would say. Pessimistic philosophers would probably say it's our projection, it's our gentrification of death. It's imposing a human face because it makes it seem less daunting. But I think Pratchett, as from a humanist perspective, and various other philosophers would say, if everything is meaningless, then all we can really rely on is ourself and ourselves, collective community, and anything that helps ease life, a friendly face on a personification of something that we will have to face in the future is valuable. Not sure if that helps answer, but yeah.
No, that's a good answer. Another question which we have is, what is your opinion on the auditors as Dev's nemesis?
On the auditors, I think it's a fascinating idea. I wish I could have gone into it way more in the paper, but the idea of the auditors not being this inhuman force in this world, but actually just being the worst of humanity acting in on itself. I think it's terrifying to see how, especially in during coronavirus and everything, how businesses are just turning people into numbers, and it demonstrates exactly what they're talking about here, which is not to put down the research that was doing statistics. I know that's for some people, but it treat it as one of the previous papers said, treating people like things is the root of the problem, and that's basically what the auditors do. They treat them as problems, but they also treat them as just a composition of materials. So it's interesting to see how death treats people as people, and this projection of bureaucracy, which is, I guess, very timely and painfully timely at the moment.
I think a sort of follow-up question here, which we immediately have, is: do you think that death is part of Terry Pratchett's attempt to make the concept of death and dying less of a taboo subject in popular culture?
I think absolutely. I think there's been a few good papers on how his references and his writing ability changed as he went on, and you can certainly see that with Death himself, how he is, more parodic, more goofy, for want of a better phrase, better words, at the beginning. So in Mort, there's a lot of Death being this imposing figure that slips over on cow poo or something like that when you first see him, a lot of undercutting his authority, whereas later on he's in control of the humor. He's not the object that you're laughing at, he's something that you're laughing with, and it's a much more empowering kind of humor. It's a laughter that it belittles problems rather than I guess it's less of a Bergsian attacking something with humor and more of a, well, we can all laugh, and if we can all laugh together, then that's brilliant, isn't it? And I think that's certainly something that he was aware of when you look at how he talks about death, especially later on when he's talking about it in the context of his illness. It was something that he was aware of. He had a very interesting relationship with his own character and with the concept, I guess. So does that answer your question, I guess? We've lost your audio.
Thank you. Thank you. Something I've heard you mention twice is pessimism as an increasingly timely philosophy. What exactly do you mean by this?
Well, so pessimism goes back as far as records go. There were ancient Greek philosophers debating whether life was actually worth enduring, right the way through, to be or not to be, and everything in between, really. But in the current era where technology is blurring the line between what living and death means, it's important that we clarify to ourselves where the boundary lies and what is enough to push you over it. It's just something that Perry, Ligotti, and indeed Pratchett were all very clear on, the fact that there's something more important than simply having a line going up and down on a heartbeat monitor kind of thing. And by that point, you don't always have the ability to change, to make the decisions that you might have done, not with foresight, not with hindsight. What do you mean? Yeah, I'm not fumbling over a word there that I can't put my finger on. But yeah, with technology increasingly making it difficult for us to say what life and death is, pessimism and discussions of philosophy that explicitly confront the value, and there's so many problems with assigning value, of course, and it's always subjective. But if it's always subjective, then how can you have a blanket decision that ranges across a whole medical profession? I think is his it's the idea that comes across through a lot of his work, and a lot of pessimistic philosophy, even if that wasn't his personal view, though I suspect it was.
Oliver, thank you again. Your responses were as thoughtful as your presentation itself. So I thought this was a great session to end the day on. Thank you very much for presenting so clearly and accurately, and see you again soon.
Thanks for having me.
As we have just mentioned, this was the final paper of the day. For me, it went a bit too fast, I must say. I could have done with some more presentations, but that's how it goes, of course. I'll also tell you that I'm mainly involved in this conference because I work here. And up until about a year ago, I had never heard of Terry Pratchett, which may be weird to many of you because it seems like it really is a very, very big cultural thing. So I didn't really know what to expect. Of course, over the past months, I've been looking around at all the things that are going on around this culture. And so now I'm noticing that there's much more to it than I could have ever imagined. The academic potential of this whole field of study is gigantic. And I would like to thank you all for kind of bringing this to my attention, for making me, say, a new aficionado of a culture you're all very much involved in. So thank you for that. Today we had sessions in the morning on various types of government. We had sessions on the representation of space. Then at noon we had this very nice intermezzo with Rob Wilkins. And then finally we had the sessions on translation and humor, where we had 4 presentations that all kind of tied in together while clearly making their own personal characteristics and their own personal touches to the life and work of Terry Pratchett. So I would say the conference is of course not over. Tomorrow we will be convening again at 9:30, I believe, for another day of great sessions. We expect to be at least as happy at the end of the day as we are today. So thank you very much for joining again. I think we can now all relax and look back upon a good experience. Thank you.